Hi everyone. So in this lecture, I will be summarizing the main arguments of King and Osayande. And I hope this summary will help you refresh your memory and you will be able to start thinking about what you think about those arguments and whether those arguments apply to the nonprofit setting you have been working at. And also think about whether you agree with the author, whether you disagree with the author. If you agree, why exactly you agree with the author, and if you don't agree, whether you can think about evidences and examples or cases to support how you feel about those arguments. So the main arguments that the authors have been talking about is the progressive philanthropic movement which emerged in the mid 1970s worked in collaboration with the nonprofit industrial complex. So think about this word called philanthropy. When we think about philanthropy, usually philanthropy in our societies have a really good and strong connotations, right? When people talk about philanthropers, they're like, oh, that's an amazing person, and they're just giving away their wealth, and what an amazing job this is. And the authors are coming from a really interesting and to some extent useful perspective because they are questioning the stance of progressive philanthropic movement. They're not just accepting the romanticized idea that it's just an amazing idea to give away your wealth, and they're actually questioning the motive, and they're questioning who exactly is getting benefited from these giveaway initiatives and whether there is any underlying politics in it, whether there is a racialized politics, whether there is a capitalist politics. And the authors argue that the goal of the philanthropic movements is mainly to stop radical social change. And how do they do that? So it connects with the previous discussion on the non-profit industrial complex. And if you remember, the non-profit industrial complex talked about how progressive social movements are in our societies controlled and surveilled by non-profit organizations and the whole structure surrounding non-profit organizations. So again, when there is a society where social movements are taking place, people usually talk about bringing, radical changes in the structures of operation. People talk about criticizing capitalism. People talk about redistribution of wealth. But when we think about nonprofit industrial complex, it's basically talking about, okay, don't focus too much energy on social movements. Here are those nonprofit organizations. And again, most of the nonprofit organizations are service providers. So they provide service to people. For example, immigrant rights organizations. In many cases, they're not necessarily immigrant rights organizations. They're organizations that provide different services to immigrants. So maybe they're teaching them English, or maybe they're helping them submit resumes. Maybe they're helping them with writing their resumes and finding jobs where they can apply, but they're not necessarily questioning the discriminatory immigration laws in our country. They're not necessarily questioning the really complicated process of applying for asylum at the border, and they're not necessarily questioning what's happening in the southern border and when children are put in the cage. And again, when you register as a nonprofit organization, if you apply for the 501c3 status, you can't necessarily spend more than 25% of your wealth for advocacy. So again, by registering as a nonprofit organization automatically curtails the radical potential of a nonprofit organization to bring social changes. So the nonprofit industrial complex, just to refresh your memory, it talks about how there's this growing tendency of encouraging more and more organizations to register as nonprofit organizations, and how indirect and direct incentives are provided if they provide service instead of uh, getting engaged in radical social justice movements. And the whole process of funding those non-profit organizations and running those non-profit organizations is basically to curtail radical grassroots organizing that strive for social change. So that's the main idea of what is called non-profit industrial complex. And King and Osayande both are arguing that the progressive philanthropy movement works in close alliance with the non-profit industrial complex. And the goal of the progressive philanthropy is mostly to undermine radical social change and disrupt movement for wealth and power distribution, especially by people of color. So there is a racial aspect underlined in it. So the goal of progressive philanthropy is mostly, as the authors are arguing, they're talking about they mostly compel private and public foundations to support social justice causes. So it's not about questioning the source of their wealth. It's not about questioning how come you became so rich. It's mostly about, oh, you got so much money, so now spend some money for some good social justice causes. So for example, they do it by encouraging programs like workplace giving campaigns, or they introduce social action and community funds. They monitor tax breaks, and they also prevent foundations from including administrative costs in their payout to nonprofits. So when a foundation makes a grant to a nonprofit organization, they can't just say that, oh, we also have administrative costs, and the money that you're getting, that should also cover, the grant should also cover our administrative costs. So the goal of progressive philanthropy is that you can't do all these things. And the goal is to make philanthropy more efficient so that nonprofit organizations get more money to do the things that they're trying to do. But the authors are coming from a very critical perspective, and we are saying that these are mostly cosmetic adjustments because they don't necessarily challenge the capitalist foundations of those organizations. They don't necessarily question, like I said, how did you accumulate so much of resources and where did that money come from? And you're giving away so much money, so with the donation there is this question of accountability, right? So if you get a grant from a funder, you have to make sure that your programs are designed according to the priority of your funder. You are not necessarily designing your programs according to the need of the community. So is this problematic? So the progressive philanthropy doesn't necessarily ask those questions. And the authors also say that the progressive philanthropic movements are mostly led by white, progressive left, and they ignored the work of communities of color. So if you think about the nonprofit organizations that work in our societies, you can specifically think about the nonprofit organizations in the greater Boston areas or the nonprofit organizations where you are working at. Think about the demography of the staff members who are serving in the board of directors, who are supervising you. Is it mostly white people? Are there representations of people of color? How their class affiliation look like? Are they coming from middle class, college educated background? What exactly does it look like? And the authors also said that the progressive philanthropy movement also benefit white privilege of white progressive left. Because the white progressive left, as the authors argue, they work in close connection with the wealth of the white right. So this is an interesting twist, because on one hand we actually strengthen those dichotomies all the time in our societies. There's this left and there's this right, and left thinks like this and right thinks like that. Now the author is basically saying that the liberal white progressives are very closely allied with the white right, and I would say that it's not just a white right, it's a rich white liberal group as well. And the authors are then saying that they led the white progressive left to act as brokers between capital and the oppressed people of color. And so they basically, the white progressive left is acting as, the manager of resources between the rich white donors and the people of color who they are serving. And they are not necessarily challenging systems of oppression and exploitation or domination, because they also get incentives from sustaining this exploitative system. And the authors specifically talk about racial hierarchies within nonprofit organizations. And think about the organization where you are working. Are there racial hierarchies? Like I said, who makes the decisions, and how does the demography of the decision making body look like? The authors are saying that white-led social justice nonprofits operate in close connection with white-led rich and capitalist foundations, unlike small grassroots organizations led by communities of color. I'm sorry, there's a spelling mistake. It should be by communities of color. And the authors are also saying that wide-led social justice nonprofits secure philanthropic contributions through maintaining relationships with the white capital, which eventually maintains systems of white supremacy. So again, when you are running an organization, you have to, and specifically if you are running a 501c3 organization, you have to make sure that you get money to run that organization. It's not necessarily the case all the time that you get a huge amount of federal grants, or you get a huge amount of grant that doesn't have any string attached. And you have to actively search for grants. You have to actively raise money to pay your salary and to run the projects you are working on. So in most of the cases, the non-profit organizations in our societies are led by white people, educated white middle class people, and they have to stay in close connection with foundations and program officers, and they have to stay in good touch with them, and sometimes they have to rely on personal and professional connections to make sure that they get the money that they need to run their programs. And also the authors talked about disbursement of discretionary funds. So oftentimes they don't even have to apply for funding. There is not necessarily a competitive process. If you know someone at a foundation who likes your work, they can just give you the money. So there is absolutely no competition, and there is value in nurturing those relationships with the foundations. And the authors are also talking about how young, economically privileged people come out of college and then they start nonprofits. So they don't necessarily start working with the broader goal of challenging the structures or questioning the capitalism. The goal is to start a nonprofit organization and get a huge amount of funding, and then just keep going with the flow. And this is also a really interesting point. The authors are saying that oftentimes this whole liberal, progressive, philanthropic movement makes a creative use of people of color. So the first half of the article talks about how oftentimes those nonprofit organizations and those progressive philanthropic movements are led by white people, and then the author starts talking about, oh, it's not just white people, it's also people of color who are co-opted by the movement. So again, if you have those, like symbolic, iconic people of color in your board of members, or in your decision making body, it just looks good because you can show that, oh, we have people of color in our body, so we are very diverse and we are racially sensitive. But the people of color are recruited by the progressive philanthropic movement to serve the purpose of the progressive philanthropic movement. And the author is criticizing that just having people of color is not enough. You need people of color with the right kind of politics, with the right level of awareness. And the authors are also criticizing this idea of grassroots funding, which is really interesting. If you are following the election campaign, you will see that there's this huge discussion about how you shouldn't take corporate funding, how you shouldn't take PAC money, and how you should rely on grassroots funding. And the authors are taking the criticism one step further, and they are saying that you can't just romanticize grassroots funding, because if you look at the numbers, you will see that most of the philanthropic dollars come from individuals. So although there is this really popular effort to encourage nonprofit organizations to shift their focus away from foundations, because again, foundation money is competitive and there are just not enough foundations to support all grassroots initiatives. So many nonprofit organizations are actively encouraged to move away from foundations and spend resources and spend time and effort in grassroots fundraising. Now the authors are basically saying that, well, think about the whole model of grassroots funding. It's not like individual people are chipping away like $1, $2. Maybe you are just reaching out to a very small number of individuals who are giving the most amount of philanthropic dollars. So which actually means that you have to stay in close connection with rich people to raise money, and in most of the cases they're white people coming from privileged groups. So it actually shapes the focus away from foundations, and it encourages individual nonprofit organizations to maintain close connection with wealthy white donors. So it indirectly discourages organizations, there's another spelling mistake, I'm sorry, to spend time in building movements and dismantling the very systems of oppression. And then there is another theory, it's called spin down theory. So apparently it's a liberal theory because it's basically saying that foundations shouldn't exist, but it's not like you are just, saying that billionaires shouldn't exist and people can't accumulate so much of wealth. It's saying that foundations should gradually spin themselves out of existence. And the authors are saying that it sounds like a great idea, but the problem is it kind of highlights this personal sacrifice as if, oh, you accumulated so much resources. And by the way, it's not personal wealth, it's foundation. And when you start a foundation, you get a certain amount of tax break, and you can invest your money so that the money grows, and you can maintain a certain amount of endowment. So it's not even like you're just giving away all of your personal wealth. And also, it doesn't necessarily question how you have accumulated so much of wealth. So it doesn't necessarily challenge the status quo. And the other thing is, it's not necessarily questioning that when a foundation gives away resources, by giving away that resources, they're exercising indirect control over the nonprofit organization, because there are many foundations which have very conservative goals. There are foundations, for example, who don't necessarily believe in climate change. So they specifically sponsor nonprofit organizations or individual efforts who are, say, for example, kind of encouraging this discourse about oh no, climate change is a hoax and it doesn't exist. So it doesn't necessarily question how those nonprofit organizations are supporting initiatives that may not necessarily serve broader social justice purpose or broader social change purpose. It doesn't necessarily question the status quo. It doesn't necessarily question that by giving away the money, the foundations are exerting direct and indirect control over what nonprofit organizations can or cannot do. And also, there is absolutely no question of redistribution of funds. So that's the overall summary of the main arguments. And I guess now you can start thinking about whether those arguments actually apply to the setting where you have worked or the nonprofit organizations you have known so far, and whether you actually agree or disagree with the arguments.